Welcome back to British Royal News TV. In this particular episode, we're diving deep into the complex, dramatic, and sometimes shocking life of King George V, otherwise known as the Sailor Prince. Trust me, the story you're about to hear isn't just a dull retelling of a king's daily duties. It's packed with hidden drama, heartbreak, betrayal, and more than a few eyebrow-raising twists. Let's set the stage. George Frederick Ernest Albert was born on June 3, 1865, at Marlborough House in London. That's already quite a mouthful, both the name and the address. This was no ordinary household, though. He was the grandson of Queen Victoria, meaning drama was basically in his DNA. And that drama started even before he could walk or talk. George's father was Albert Edward, the Prince of Wales, the future King Edward VII, and his mother was Princess Alexandra of Denmark. They weren't just your run-of-the-mill royals waving elegantly from palace balconies. They had a secret. For a bunch of folks who should have been the epitome of class and propriety, they were a royal family brimming with controversies. Growing up in a royal mansion sounds like a dream. Lavish rooms, fancy clothes, and all the perks you can imagine. But young George's family dynamic was complicated by the looming presence of his grandmother, Queen Victoria. It's fair to say that Queen Victoria was not always in the best of moods, especially when it came to George's father. She basically blamed Albert Edward for the loss of her beloved husband. In her eyes, if Edward hadn't been such a scandal-prone playboy in his youth, maybe her husband wouldn't have been so stressed and wouldn't have passed as he did. So, she gave Albert Edward zero real responsibilities, and as many of us know, idle hands can lead to questionable hobbies. If you're a prince with all the time in the world and an itch for adventure, where might you go? Parisian brothels, apparently. From young George's perspective, his dad seemed like a larger-than-life figure. Albert Edward, ironically enough, was pretty popular in certain circles. He had the charm and flamboyance that attracted a devoted following. George likely admired his dad, not knowing that behind the scenes, Dirty Birdie was a name whispered in certain corners, reflecting the prince's less-than-angelic escapades across the channel. Meanwhile, George's mother, Alexandra of Denmark, was a paragon of patience and resilience. She turned a blind eye to Albert Edward's exploits in places no respectable grandmother wants to imagine. She put her energy into raising 6 children. And that's right, you heard correctly. George was just one of several royal siblings. The household was full of little princes and princesses, but each of them had a path that was shaped by Queen Victoria's often tense relationship with their father. It was like living in the shadow of not just a grandmother who ruled the empire, but also a father who could vanish to France for business while everyone politely avoided the subject. George, from a young age, had one brother who overshadowed him in terms of future prospects, Prince Albert Victor, older by about a year. Because succession rules placed Albert Victor first in line for the throne, George was theoretically never meant to be king. He could have lived a relatively carefree life of a royal spare. Despite the difference in their destinies, George and Albert Victor were incredibly close. They studied together, played together, grew up under the same tutors. When it became clear that neither of them was exactly a star pupil, their father decided to make men of them by sending them both into the Royal Navy. Because, in that era, what better way to carve a path to masculinity than the open seas? Picture 2 teenage princes boarding the HMS Bacchante, taking in the salty ocean breeze, bright-eyed and ready for adventure. Instead of endless arithmetic or dull Latin lessons, they were out exploring the far reaches of the British Empire, visiting places from the Caribbean to Australia to South Africa. One of the most legendary episodes from this time took place in Japan, where George, apparently in the throes of teenage excitement, decided to get himself inked. That's right, George got a tattoo of a dragon in blue and red on his arm. It scandalized the family to no end. Royals, after all, were supposed to remain impeccably pristine. Eventually, the training voyage ended, and George and Albert Victor's paths diverged. The older brother, next in line for the throne, was sent to Trinity College, Cambridge, while George stuck with the Royal Navy. This was the era when George had his first taste of love, and it was complicated, as many royal romances tend to be. He fell for his cousin, Princess Marie of Edinburgh, while serving alongside his uncle, Princess Marie's father, in Malta. If your eyebrows just shot up at the cousin part, you're not alone. But remember, this is the same royal family that had a tradition of intermarrying for political alliances. George quickly decided he wanted to propose, and bizarrely enough, a number of senior royals, like Queen Victoria, gave their blessings. But not everyone was on board. Some family members thought the match carried political headaches. The result? Princess Marie was nudged to turn George down, and she later became the Queen of Romania. Around the same time, George came close to death when he contracted typhoid, the illness that had supposedly claimed his grandfather years earlier. For 6 weeks, the entire royal family hovered anxiously by his bedside, hoping for recovery. He did pull through, and everyone breathed a collective sigh of relief, having dodged a bullet. But the specter of tragedy was lurking elsewhere, and it wouldn't be long before it struck in a way that would rewrite George's entire future. Albert Victor, the golden boy and future king, was not exactly upholding the shining moral example his father might have hoped for. In fact, scandal swirled around him like perfume at a royal ball. Whisperings of illicit encounters, possible visits to questionable establishments, and rumors that sometimes took on a wilder spin about his personal life. All of these plagued Albert Victor. Then, in 1891, it seemed like maybe he would settle down after all. He got engaged to Princess Mary of Teck. She was refined, gracious, and exactly the type of woman the family hoped might stabilize him. But Albert Victor never made it to the altar. In January 1892, just 6 weeks after the engagement was announced, tragedy struck. He fell prey to pneumonia during an influenza pandemic. He passed at 28, leaving everyone shocked and grieving, none more so than George, who had basically lost his best friend. Albert Victor's death catapulted George into a role he never expected nor particularly wanted. He became second in line to the throne. With Albert Victor gone, everyone's attention swiveled uncomfortably toward him. But that wasn't the only surprise in store. Queen Victoria, matriarch of the family, had the brilliant idea of pairing George with none other than Princess Mary of Teck, yes, his late brother's fiancée. It sounds bizarre to modern ears, but for Queen Victoria, Mary of Teck was already vetted for the family, so why let a good match go to waste? It must have been beyond awkward at first, but as months passed, George and Mary found they shared a bond forged through collective grief. Their mutual support transformed into genuine affection. A year after Albert Victor's death, George proposed to Mary, and she accepted. While to outsiders it might have looked like a convenient arrangement, in reality it became a devoted partnership. They wrote each other affectionate letters when apart, and Mary gave George a sense of groundedness, maybe exactly what he needed, given his new trajectory toward the throne. Eventually, the pair had 6 children, 5 sons and 1 daughter. But George, having been raised by a father who believed in discipline through intimidation, employed a rather strict parenting style. My father was frightened of his mother. I was frightened of my father, and I am going to see to it that my children are frightened of me, he allegedly said, which is certainly one approach to parenthood. At the same time, George refused to live the excessive and opulent life that many might expect of someone who was next in line for the crown. Instead, he and Mary raised their family at York Cottage in Norfolk, a relatively modest estate, for royals anyway. This might sound charming, but it also gave George plenty of opportunity to indulge in his two favorite hobbies, stamp collecting and hunting. Let's just say that one of those hobbies can be pretty harmless, but the other was practically a bloodbath. George had a well-documented obsession with shooting game. If you're picturing a countryside gent walking around with a shotgun, occasionally taking down a pheasant or two, you're not really capturing the scale of it. At one point, during a 10-day trip in India, he reportedly shot 21 tigers, 8 rhinoceroses, and a bear. On a particularly infamous December day in 1913, George took aim at pheasants for about 6 hours and bagged somewhere in the ballpark of 1,000. That's a bird every 20 seconds or so, which is as over the top as it sounds. Even he admitted that was a little too far. Clearly, when King George V went into something, he went all in. He ascended to the throne in 1910 when his father, King Edward VII, finally succumbed to illness. Edward's reign lasted just 9 years, almost comical compared to Victoria's 63-year marathon. George was devastated to lose his father. He wrote of being heartbroken and overwhelmed with grief, yet he had little time to mourn. The political situation in Europe was teetering on the edge. Sure enough, by August 4, 1914, the Great War, later known as World War I, was underway. George confided in his diary that the decision to declare war on Germany was a terrible catastrophe, and he prayed it would end swiftly. But it wouldn't. The war turned into a 4-year slog that reshaped the entire continent, leaving George at the helm of a British Empire that was hemorrhaging blood and treasure. This was the war that pitted him directly against his first cousin, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany. Imagine having a cousin you once played with at family gatherings, turning into the biggest villain in the eyes of your nation. With so many British men fighting and dying against the Germans, the public started to question the fact that their royal family itself was German by lineage. Remember, George was from the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, a name that did not sit well with a public that associated anything German with the horrors of trench warfare. So, in 1917, George made one of the most symbolic moves of his reign. He rebranded the royal house, discarding the Germanic name and proclaiming they would henceforth be the House of Windsor. He even insisted that his relatives like Prince Louis of Battenberg change their names to something less obviously German, hence Louis Mountbatten. It was a savvy bit of PR, considering the anti-German sentiment in wartime Britain. Still, not all problems could be solved by a rebrand. That same year, George faced another moral and political dilemma. His other first cousin was Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, a man who closely resembled George in both appearance and aristocratic bearing. The Bolshevik Revolution in Russia unseated the Tsar and put his entire family in grave danger. At first, the British government planned to offer them asylum in Britain, but George, perhaps fearing internal backlash or potential revolutionary fervor at home, quietly blocked the plan. As a result, Tsar Nicholas and his family were left to the mercy of the Bolsheviks, and we all know how that ended. They were executed, leaving a bloody stain on George's conscience. He effectively abandoned his own cousin to a terrible fate. It's one of those dark chapters that reveal how big geopolitical fears can override even the strongest family ties. By the time World War I ended in 1918, George V likely expected some emotional respite. However, heartbreak struck him personally once again. His youngest son, Prince John, had been born in 1905 with frail health and complications that included severe epilepsy. He lived most of his short life away from the public eye, and though the family's approach to his care has been debated, There's no doubt that George and Mary felt a deep sadness watching their son suffer. In January 1919, John died in his sleep at just 13. Devastated, George wrote that his loss was the greatest mercy possible because the boy's struggles had been so profound. It's a rare, humanizing glimpse of a king who was often seen as stern and somewhat distant. Although George was never a natural showman, he found an unexpected way to connect with his people. Radio. In 1932, he delivered the first ever royal Christmas speech. It was a new medium, and he wasn't keen at first, but advisors convinced him this was the perfect way to reach his subjects. It became a resounding success that turned him into something of a paternal voice for the entire country. Through the radio, the king could enter the living rooms of ordinary Britons, offering words of comfort or encouragement. People started to see George V as a steadfast figure of continuity in a rapidly changing world. By 1935, when he celebrated his Silver Jubilee, throngs of people came out to celebrate. He reportedly marveled, "I cannot understand it. After all, I am only a very ordinary sort of fellow." It was a modest statement from a man who literally wore a crown. But let's talk about the biggest sore spot. His eldest son and heir, Edward, later Edward VIII. If ever there was a father-son dynamic that epitomized mutual exasperation, this was it. George was a man who believed in tradition, discipline, and duty. Edward was, well, a bit of a hot mess, really. He was a womanizer, drawn to married women and scandalous affairs, and he espoused views about other races that were beyond offensive. Just reading his letters can make you cringe. The tension between father and son ratcheted up as Edward drifted further into questionable relationships and an all-around reckless lifestyle. There was a moment that nearly blew up in the press. Edward had been romantically involved with one Marguerite Alibert, a one-time sex worker who later shot her new lover in the back, multiple times, in a London hotel. To avoid a humiliating scandal, George had to frantically ensure that Edward's name never surfaced at the trial. He succeeded, but the stress and resentment lodged deeper in the king's heart. Meanwhile, George's second son, Albert, who would become King George VI, was the quiet, dutiful type, and George's granddaughter, Princess Elizabeth, the future Queen Elizabeth II, was already showing the poised confidence that would define her reign. George adored them both. He found them to be the kind of stable, respectable royals that Edward, with all his flash and feckless escapades, simply wasn't. As George's health started to falter, he expressed a desperate hope that Edward would never marry and produce heirs. "I pray to God my eldest son will never marry and have children, and that nothing will come between Bertie and Lilibet and the throne," he once confided. Clearly, he sensed his time was running out, and he feared what Edward might do with the crown. That time came in 1936. George had never fully recovered from several health scares, including a serious injury when a horse threw him during the First World War. The decades of heavy smoking took their toll too. By January of that year, his doctors saw the writing on the wall. His condition was terminal, and he was rapidly declining. Summoning what remained of his strength, he retired to Sandringham House, a quiet estate in the countryside. In the last days of his life, the palace issued bulletins that made it clear the end was near. On the night of January 20th, 1936, the official statement announced that George V had passed peacefully in his sleep. In reality, the story was a bit more macabre. Decades later, it emerged from the diaries of his personal physician, Lord Dawson of Penn, that the doctor had administered lethal injections of morphine and cocaine to hasten the king's end. He apparently wanted to spare the family from witnessing a prolonged death, and also ensure that the announcement could appear in the morning papers rather than the less appropriate evening journals. It was essentially a deliberate act of euthanasia on the King of England. With George's death, Edward ascended to the throne. He lasted less than a year. His insistence on marrying the twice-divorced American socialite Wallis Simpson set off a constitutional crisis. And we know how that ended. Edward abdicated in December 1936, passing the crown to his stammering but resolute brother Albert, who took the name George VI. In a sense, George V's wish was granted. Edward didn't have children, and eventually the crown passed down to little Lilibet, the granddaughter he adored, who would go on to become Queen Elizabeth II. And there you have it, an extraordinary saga that began in the heart of London and spun across oceans, through palace corridors and battlefields, forging a tale so layered you could spend countless hours unraveling it. The sailor prince who became King George V might have been overshadowed in popular memory by his grandmother, Queen Victoria, or his granddaughter, Queen Elizabeth II, but his legacy is woven into the very fabric of the modern monarchy. So the next time you hear the name Windsor, remember the man behind that rebranding, the one who hunted big game, wrote heartfelt letters, gazed upon an empire in conflict, and, in the end, was ushered out of this world by a doctor's syringe. If you're fascinated, if you find it dramatic and almost cinematic, that's because it truly is. Royalty may seem distant and untouchable, but, as George Fafe's life proves, their stories resonate with the raw emotions, love, grief, pride, fear, and hope that shape us all. Thank you for joining this exploration into one of history's most intriguingly complex monarchs. Perhaps you came for the scandal, or maybe for the family drama, or even just to find out the truth behind those epic hunting sprees. Whatever your reason, I hope you've discovered that George V's life goes far beyond what you'd expect from a figure sometimes written off as a buttoned-up, old-fashioned king. He was very much a product of his time, yet he also left a mark that traveled beyond his era. For better or worse, his decisions rippled through history, influencing everything from royal naming conventions to the fate of entire nations. So, as you log off from this deep dive, keep in mind that behind every coronation painting or stately portrait, there is a human story with complexities, flaws, triumphs, and tragedies, sometimes more than we could ever imagine. George V's story reminds us that kings and queens aren't immune to family feuds, heartbreak, or questionable judgment calls. They're just as human as any of us, only with bigger houses, fancier titles, and, in this case, a tattoo of a dragon on their arm. Let that be a mental image that stays with you. A teenage sailor prince in Japan, wincing slightly as an artist inks a dragon onto royal skin, blissfully unaware of the tumultuous road that lay ahead, the tragedies and triumphs that would define his reign, and the hidden secrets that, decades after his passing, would make the world see the final chapter of his life in a whole new light.